These lectures are part of the Great Courses series. They are produced by the Teaching Company. These lectures are titled Great Authors of the Western Literary Tradition, Part 7, Modern Literature. Lecture 73, Henry James.
I'm not in my first youth. I can do what I choose. I belong quite to the independent class. I've neither father nor mother. I'm poor and of a serious disposition. I'm not pretty. I therefore am not bound to be timid and conventional. Indeed, I can't afford such luxuries. Besides, I try to judge things for myself. To judge wrong, I think, is more honorable than not to judge at all. I don't wish to be a mere sheep in a flock. I wish to choose my fate and know something of human affairs beyond what other people think it compatible with propriety to tell me. Thus speaks Isabel Archer, the young American heroine of Henry James's 8th novel, Portrait of a Lady, first published in 1881. By this point of the novel, about a third of the way into it, Isabel has been spirited off to England by her wealthy aunt and has already captured the hearts of two remarkable young men. One of them is a handsome, charming, and fabulously wealthy English lord named Warburton, with 50,000 acres, half a dozen houses, a seat in Parliament, and an income of £100,000 a year. Good Lord, what a catch! But in spite of his seemingly irresistible attractions, especially for a young woman who rightly calls herself poor, she turns him down. And in the passage I've just quoted, which comes shortly after, she rejects an American suitor, a muscular Bostonian businessman named Caspar Goodwood. Goodwood has crossed the ocean to repeat a proposal that he first made just before she left America, and he must now suffer the humiliation of being rejected once again. In some ways, Isabel Archer looks familiar. High-spirited, opinionated, playful, and fully confident of her own judgment, right or wrong. She calls to mind Elizabeth Bennet, the heroine of Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. Like Elizabeth, she's unafraid to speak her mind to her elders or to anyone else. Early on in the novel, an eccentric old woman whom Isabel has never met comes to visit her in Albany, New York, where she's grown up with her two elder sisters. When the old woman speaks of Isabel's late mother as "my poor sister," Isabel promptly says, "Ah, you must be our crazy Aunt Lydia." Whether or not Elizabeth Bennet would say exactly this, it echoes her spirit well enough. For both she and Isabel radiate boldness and sometimes even defiance. Not only do both of them reject two proposals in a row, both of them reject, at least for a time, what sounds like an absolutely dazzling suitor. Elizabeth spurns the wealthy, handsome Mr. Darcy, who owns an elegant estate and has an income of £10,000. Isabel spurns a man whose wealth and land and status make Darcy look like a tenant farmer. But this doesn't mean that Isabel is just another Elizabeth. Besides magnifying the wealth and grandeur of the suitor that Isabel rejects, Henry James constructs a heroine fundamentally different from Jane Austen's. Elizabeth Bennet definitely wants to find and marry the right man. And once Darcy learns to be truly considerate of her, he wins her hand. But who can win the hand of a woman who doesn't want to marry anyone at all? That's Isabel Archer. Talking with her cousin Ralph just after she turns down Warburton, she says, "I don't see what harm there is in my wishing not to tie myself. I don't want to begin life by marrying. There are other things a woman can do." Does this sound familiar? Young American women have been talking like this for at least the past 30 years. But if it sounds to us now like conventional feminist wisdom, it was anything but conventional in the late 19th century. In making his heroine reject a fabulously rich English lord, who was also thoroughly gracious, cultivated, and considerate, James overhauls the plot of romance. Isabel herself knows that she's tearing that plot into shreds. When Warburton comes to make his proposal, he finds her alone in the park of an old English country house, the house of her aunt and uncle, both expatriate Americans. Given the setting and the suitor, Isabel feels like a romantic heroine, a woman who has only to say yes and live happily ever after with the man of her dreams. But she says no. And she doesn't just reject Warburton in favor of Goodwood or vice versa. Instead, she rejects marriage itself in favor of something intangible, elusive, and thoroughly modern: self-realization. Now that she's come to England, Isabel yearns to roam freely, to explore the old world of Europe, to see its culture and its people for herself. She thus exemplifies the sort of character that Henry James made supremely his own: the American abroad. By the spring of 1880, when Henry James started writing Portrait of a Lady, he had already made his name as a writer in both England and America. Born 37 years earlier in New York City, he was the grandson of an Irish immigrant who had come to America in 1789, settled in Albany, and made a fortune that left his children, including the father of the novelist, leisured for life. Young Henry was privately schooled in New York until the age of 12, when he and his siblings, 5 in all, were taken abroad by their parents. 6 years later, after more schooling in England, France, and Switzerland, he moved with the family to Newport, Rhode Island, studied law briefly at Harvard, and then started writing stories and reviews that were published in Boston and New York. In 1876, after his first 2 novels appeared, James settled in London, where he began to develop the international theme that would periodically occupy him for the rest of his life. Starting with a novel titled simply The American, published in 1877, he set out to show how a particular American is shaped and informed by living in Europe. In The American, as well as in some of his later novels, notably The Ambassadors, the story revolves around the experience of a man. But in Daisy Miller, a short story first published in 1878, James creates a female protagonist. By telling the story of an American girl who is snubbed in Rome for breaking social rules that she doesn't understand, James not only achieved a runaway success, he also raised the question he would go on to explore and pursue in Portrait of a Lady. The question is this: given a young American woman of keen intelligence, high spirit, firm self-confidence, and uncorrupted morality, what will she do in Europe? In the old world that her ancestors boldly left behind them, in a world of high culture, knit together by strange customs and often shadowed by low intrigue. To this question, the long tradition of quest romance and the briefer history of the novel furnishes a predictable answer: she will find a husband. But James knew only too well that this was a stale formula. So he creates a heroine who isn't looking for a husband at all. And just to underscore the point that she can't be swept off her feet by even the grandest man imaginable, she says no to Lord Warburton. In rejecting Warburton, Isabel takes a significant step beyond the self-assertive heroines who came before her. These include not only Elizabeth Bennet, but also Dorothea Brooke, the heroine of George Eliot's Middlemarch, which appeared about 10 years before James's Portrait of a Lady. Young, beautiful, and heir to a fine estate, Dorothea is courted by a handsome, amiable baronet named James Chettam. But she rejects him because he can't begin to satisfy her spiritual aspirations. As Eliot suggests in her preface to the novel, Dorothea recalls St. Teresa of Avila, whose passionate ideal nature demanded an epic life, and who made her name by founding and reforming religious orders in 16th century Spain. Dorothea herself founds nothing, but she decides early on in the novel that she can best fulfill her high ambitions by marrying a middle-aged clergyman bent on writing a book that will furnish the key to all mythologies. Her life's work, she believes, will be to help him produce his monumental book. Isabel wants nothing of the kind. She has no desire to serve a great cause or a great man or to save the world. She might eventually do something to alleviate its misery, but that will come, if at all, only after she has gained a general impression of life. She might eventually marry, but only after she has freely explored the world for herself. Specifically, she wants to experience Europe, not just by visiting the usual tourist attractions, but also by getting to know its people and their ways. As an American, she loves liberty, and she will exercise her own liberty abroad. Temperamentally independent, self-confident, and resolutely single, at least for a time, Isabel Archer seems to embody the American ideal of self-reliance, something preached in the earlier 19th century by Emerson and Thoreau. But neither Emerson nor Thoreau would have thought her self-reliant for an instant. For one thing, she depends almost entirely on other people to support her. Unlike her friend Henrietta Stackpole, a journalist, Isabel never holds a job of any kind. With nothing but a small income from her modest inheritance, she relies almost entirely on the generosity of her aunt and uncle, especially the uncle. And when the uncle dies about a third of the way into the novel, he leaves her a fortune sufficient to live on quite comfortably for the rest of her life. James thus raises a fascinating question. First, suppose a young, vibrant, beautiful, independent-minded American woman. Then, suppose her rich enough so that she has nothing in particular to do, no job of any kind, not even the task of finding a man to support her. Suppose a woman like that, and then try to answer the question, what will she do? What she does in this novel is bound up with what she sees, what she feels, what she perceives as the center of consciousness. And keeping his own eye on this center of consciousness, James takes another step beyond earlier novelists, in particular beyond George Eliot. In Middlemarch, Eliot's omniscient narration presents the whole world of an English country town from a variety of perspectives. James does something else. Instead of shifting from one viewpoint to another, each of his novels unfolds from the experience of a single person, a supremely sensitive center of consciousness, a point at which all rays of experience converge. This does not mean first-person narration, for James tells his story largely in the third person, and occasionally he shows us scenes that Isabel does not see. But the novel is constructed in such a way as to make us feel that it is essentially the story of Isabel's experience. James puts us inside her head and makes us see the world through her eyes. And her eyes are continually engaged in seeing others, above all in seeing their relation to her. Each of the others plays a part in her continuing education, her gradual acclimation to European culture, without ever erasing her American identity. Curiously enough, nearly all the would-be Europeans we meet in this novel turn out to have been born in America and more or less reshaped by years of living abroad. But while some of them have virtually disowned their American identity, others have kept it alive. Isabel's uncle Daniel Touchett was born in Rutland, Vermont, came to England as a young man, made a fortune in banking, and then bought Gardencourt, the grand old English country house where Isabel spends the first part of her life abroad. But in spite of all his years in England, Touchett, we are told, had no intention of dis-Americanizing, nor had he a desire to teach his only son any such subtle art. So far as I know, the word dis-Americanizing does not appear in any dictionary, but its meaning is clear enough. Touchett has no intention of becoming an Englishman, let alone a European, no intention of forgetting his Yankee roots, nor does he want his son to forget them, and Ralph doesn't. Though he first came to England as a very small boy and has spent most of his life there, he too considers himself still American. When Henrietta Stackpole learns that Ralph will probably never go back to America, she asks him if he thinks it right to give up his country. "Ah," says Ralph, "one doesn't give up one's country any more than one gives up one's grandmother. They're both antecedent to choice, elements of one's composition that are not to be eliminated." All the same, Ralph himself lives in such a way as to make us wonder just how much of an American he's remained. He looks very un-American to Henrietta Stackpole, who has just been sent over by an American newspaper to report on people and places in England and on the continent. Like Henry James himself, Henrietta earns her living by her pen. And when she comes to Gardencourt, she's appalled by Ralph's idleness. "What does he do for a living?" she asked of Isabel the evening of her arrival. "Does he go around all day with his hands in his pockets?" "He does nothing," smiled Isabel. "He's a gentleman of large leisure." "Well, I call that a shame. Would I have to work like a car conductor?" Miss Stackpole replied. "I should like to show him up." He's in wretched health. He's quite unfit for work, Isabel urged. Pshaw, don't you believe it. I work when I'm sick, cried her friend. Here's one illustration of the difference between the old world and the new, England and America. While it's always risky to generalize about any country, I think it's safe to say that the gentleman of leisure is an English type, or at least a type enshrined in English novels such as Pride and Prejudice, where none of the chief male characters does any work at all. Almost none, I should say. By contrast, Isabel's Bostonian suitor is a hard-driving businessman, and her friend Henrietta articulates what might be called a characteristically American pride in her capacity to support herself, to stay on the job even when she's sick. This pride in her own work goes hand in hand with a residually Puritan disdain for idleness, and hence a contempt for Ralph's way of life, an urge to show him up. Since James himself made his living by writing, after his father led a life of leisure, we might expect his novel to take the side of the hard-working American reporter against the Anglo-American idler. But Henrietta personifies precisely the kind of writer that James chose not to be. It's interesting to note that in his late 20s and early 30s, he wrote travel sketches and other ephemeral pieces to help pay his bills. But at the age of 33, after several months of sending articles on Paris to the New York Tribune, the editor's demand for more gossip drove him to quit. Gossip is exactly what Henrietta longs to collect. She tells Isabel that she wants to see as much as possible of the inner life of England and Europe. By this she means what we might now call the life of the insiders, the public figures and social celebrities that she tries in vain to meet. But the inner life that James represents in his fiction is something quite different. It is the inner life of his main character, the ever-changing story of what she thinks and feels and perceives as the people and places of England and Europe steadily make their impressions upon her. Isabel comes to Europe not just willing but eager to learn, to open herself up to new ways of thinking and feeling. So we can hardly expect her to share Henrietta's fervent allegiance to the American work ethic or her disdain for gentlemen of leisure. She is herself a woman of leisure, thanks to the generosity of her aunt and uncle. So when Henrietta scornfully asks what Ralph does for a living, Isabel serenely answers, "He does nothing. He's a gentleman of large leisure." Isabel's tone tells us that she's already begun to develop a respect for leisure as a way of life, as an alternative to the industrious making of money. Henrietta thus serves as a foil to Isabel. Both of them are young American women seeing England for the first time. But because Henrietta embodies and articulates simple, straightforward, all-American values, and because she disdains anything that might compromise those good old American values, she enables us to see, by contrast, Isabel's capacity to learn, her openness to new experiences. In Henrietta's eyes, Isabella's experience of life with her anglicized relatives at Gardencourt has damaged this bright American girl by distorting her views, turning her away from her old ideals. But if we look at Henrietta through the eyes of Isabel, as the novel compels us to do, we can see how blinkered Henrietta is. The Touchett family, again and again, eludes her grasp. Thinking reductively, she's determined to know whether or not they consider themselves English or American, as if they had to be absolutely one thing or another. And when she demands to know just what Ralph calls himself, Isabel says he's a cosmopolite, a citizen of the world, just as comfortable in England and Europe as he was in America. Isabel appreciates Ralph, for it is Ralph who appreciates and applauds her own ambition to live as freely as possible. And we can see this clearly from Ralph's response to her rejection of the proposal made by Warburton. But first, Isabel's motives for rejecting Warburton deserve a further look, especially in light of his stupendous attractions. Isabel rejects Warburton because his sheer magnificence intimidates her. In spite of his eagerness to gratify her every whim, she feels overwhelmed by all that he offers her. What she felt we read, was that a territorial, a political, a social magnate had conceived the design of drawing her into the system in which he rather invidiously lived and moved. A certain instinct, not imperious but persuasive, told her to resist, murmured to her that virtually she had a system and an orbit of her own. I mentioned already that in refusing to marry anyone, at least for a time, Isabel anticipates contemporary feminism. One of the questions endlessly debated by contemporary feminists is just how much power women can wield in relation to men. What this passage shows us is James's uncanny insight into Isabel's sense of this question, her fear of losing her own power to choose and shape her own life, her fear of being swallowed up by Warburton. James never married, but he enjoyed close friendships with a number of women, and I venture to say that no other male writer, not even Tolstoy or Flaubert, that no other male writer has ever surpassed his capacity to reveal a woman's inner life. Surely none has quite so precisely caught the subtle sense in which Isabel feels her very identity threatened by a proposal that, as she knows all too well, 19 women out of 20 would have instantly accepted. What makes the rejection still more striking and daring is that Isabel has no clear idea who she is, who she wants to be, or what she will do. After she turns down Goodwood, as well as Warburton, she's excited by her own power, which is nothing more or less than her power to resist two powerfully insistent men. Henrietta asks her urgently, "Do you know where you're going, Isabel Archer?" "No," says Isabel. "I haven't the least idea, and I find it very pleasant not to know." A swift carriage of a dark night, rattling with 4 horses over roads that one can't see. That's my idea of happiness. In this wild, impulsive vision of sheer romantic adventure, Isabel is teasing Henrietta, of course, playfully dismissing her anxious question. But Isabel herself knows that she is taking a risk. And no matter how independent she may be, she also knows that she cannot fully control what happens to her. On the one hand, she tells Goodwood, "I wish to choose my fate." On the other hand, she tells Warburton, "I can't escape my fate. I can't escape unhappiness." In Herman Melville's Moby Dick, you remember, Ahab defies anyone or anything to overpower him, and yet also calls himself the Fates' lieutenant, compelled to act under orders. Isabel embodies something like the same paradox. Determined to be free of all ties, especially marriage, she feels nonetheless bound to her fate, whatever that may be and whatever pain it may inflict upon her. In this daring and dangerous project, she is fully supported by just one character, her cousin Ralph. Unlike all the other men in her life, Ralph has no designs upon her, even though he obviously loves her. Since he's got tuberculosis and knows that he will die of it soon, all he asks is a chance to watch what she does after she turns down Warburton. Ralph's eagerness to see what Isabel will do motivates the most selfless act in the whole book. For it is Ralph who persuades his dying father to leave Isabel a fortune so as to put a little wind in her sails, to free her forever from the need to marry. Ralph's father is still American enough, or practical enough, to question the wisdom of this plan. "Aren't you afraid," he asks, "that she'll be victimized by fortune hunters?" To this question, Ralph says only that he's willing to take this risk in hopes of living long enough to see her meet the requirements of his imagination. So Isabel is now free to exercise her own imagination fully and to cultivate her taste by exploring the old world of Europe, a world so rich in art, music, monuments, and culture. Now, if America in this novel signifies things like practicality and gainful employment, Europe and its Europeanized Americans seem to signify one thing above all others: taste. In England and Europe, taste is the criterion by which typical Americans like Henrietta are judged to be dismally vulgar. And by this criterion, we might even find fault with dear old Mr. Touchett. His question about fortune hunters might lead us to think that, unlike Ralph, he fails to appreciate just how rare a spirit Isabel is. But James's novel is nothing if not surprising. It makes us continually wonder about the relative values of America and Europe. On the one hand, if Americans can be vulgar by European standards, they are also, comparatively speaking, innocent, honest, morally responsible, and straightforward. On the other hand, if Europeans, or rather Europeanized Americans, pride themselves on their superior taste, they may also be devious, manipulative, conspiratorial, and corrupt. To learn this fateful lesson takes Isabel nearly the rest of the book. Isabel is led into the dark wood of intrigue by a supremely cultivated woman named Madame Merle. Born in Brooklyn, but long resident in Europe, she has so thoroughly effaced the traces of her native land that she could easily pass for French, German, or Austrian. As a talented artist and pianist, a sparkling conversationalist, and an impeccably considerate house guest, she is invited everywhere, including Gardencourt, where Isabel meets her. Could any young woman who yearns to see Europe and taste its culture fail to be deeply impressed by such a paragon of social perfection? Isabel falls instantly under her spell. Even though Madame Merle's whole personality seems a facade carefully constructed to hide some dark secret, Isabel eagerly imbibes her influence. We feel the power of that influence when Madame Merle speaks to Isabel of Ralph, who has up to now been something of like a mentor to Isabel. Ralph, says Madame Merle mockingly, has made a career out of his tuberculosis. Apart from that and his pretty collection of old stuff boxes, she says, he has absolutely nothing to distinguish him. You remember that when Henrietta scolds Ralph for doing nothing, Isabel defends him. In saying nothing to defend Ralph against Madame Merle's mockery, Isabel plainly reveals that she has found a new mentor. She continues to value Ralph's friendship, but she will no longer follow his advice, especially when he warns her not to marry the man so artfully set before her by Madame Merle, Gilbert Osmond. Osmond is yet another American expatriate, a middle-aged dilettante living in Florence. With his exquisitely furnished set of rooms, Osmond considers himself the incarnation of taste. He has a great dread of vulgarity, says Ralph to Isabel. That's his special line. He hasn't any other that I know of. He lives on his income, which I suspect of not being vulgarly large. Ralph's comment wittily exposes the pretentiousness of living by taste alone. But Isabel is nonetheless enchanted by Osmond and fearful of showing bad taste when she looks at his treasures. Paradoxically, she's drawn to Osmond precisely because he has nothing but taste. Isabel knows that Osmond is a nobody. When Caspar Goodwood learns of her engagement and rushes over from America in hopes of stopping it, she tells him calmly, "I'm marrying a perfect nonentity." She knows he's the antithesis of Goodwin and Warburton, because he's neither rich, nor a man of business, nor a man known for anything in particular. But in the eyes of Isabel, his unimportance, his indifference to the very idea of importance, is his chief distinction. Though Ralph can plainly see that Osmond is a fortune hunter as well as a nobody, Isabel sees him as somehow transcendent. She prides herself on the magnanimity of her power, which is the power to marry a poor man whom she thinks is very good and very honorable. And of course, very deserving too. By the time she marries Osmond, her money has become a burden to her. What better use could she make of it, she asks herself, than to make it over to the man with the best taste in the world? What a question. Too late, she learns that the very good, very honorable man with the best taste in the world is actually vicious, treacherous, and vulgar. Too late, she learns that the cultivated world he embodies is a fallen and corrupt world where his egotism lies hidden like a serpent in a bank of flowers. Even worse, she discovers that this man, whom she freely chose to marry against all warnings, will wage relentless war on her own freedom, will do everything possible in his power to trap her in what she desolatingly comes to see as a house of darkness, a house of dumbness, a house of suffocation. As the simile about the serpent recalls the book of Genesis, it also invites us to see the story of Isabel Archer as a reenactment of the fall of humankind. Born in America, the New World, Isabel is highly intelligent, but also in many ways naive. She comes to the old world of Europe in quest of life, experience, and knowledge, precisely what Satan offers to Eve in the Garden of Eden. But what she finally craves above all is taste. In succumbing to the mysterious charm of Osmond, she devours the apple of taste, which quickly turns to bitter ashes in her mouth. I will not tell you how the book ends, but I think you will find that to endure the devastating experience of treachery in the old world of Europe, Isabel will need every ounce of the moral strength she brought with her from America. She is profoundly and indelibly changed by her experience of Europe, but like old Mr. Touchett, she is never dis-Americanized.